As a woman who has always been a tomboy, I'm no stranger to feeling isolated in male-dominated spaces. Thanks to debacles like Gamergate, more people have become aware of the challenges that female gamers and game developers face. But one thing that I haven't seen anyone talk about is the sexism found within the very roots of a show which I and many others hold dear. That show is Thomas the Tank Engine. For those of you who have been living under a rock and therefore don't know anything about Thomas the Tank Engine, the show follows the adventures of a tank engine named Thomas, who lives on an island just off the coast of England called Sodor with all his sentient vehicle friends. Since this is a show from so many childhoods around the world, I'm sure most were already aware of that much, but with those outside the fandom, and yes, there is a Thomas the Tank Engine fandom, and it's basically like the My Little Pony fandom, except fans are called Tankies instead of bronies, might not know about is the show's humble origins. The show we all know today as Thomas the Tank Engine started out as a collection of books called the Railway series. The Railway series in turn was originally just a bunch of stories that Reverend Wilbert Awdry told his son to keep him entertained while he was sick with measles. Wilbert's wife was the one who encouraged him to publish these stories, and in 1945 that finally happened. The Railway series went on to have a total of 42 books, a little over half of which were written by Wilbert, with the rest being written by his son Christopher Awdry. After many trials and tribulations, Thomas the Tank Engine premiered in October 1984, with the majority of the episodes, in its first 4 seasons, being adaptations of stories from the Railway series. The key takeaway here is the creator of the Railway series, and therefore Thomas the Tank Engine was a reverend. Why does that matter, you ask? Well, anyone who knows anything about the religions of the world should be able to tell that men and women aren't exactly created equal in most of them. In Christianity specifically, Eve is said to have opened up Adam, and consequently all of humanity to sin with the whole forbidden fruit thing. This has led to the church deeming women as inherently weaker in a spiritual sense. Hence why women are rarely allowed to be pastors or in any other position that gives them authority over men. Now, I'm not trying to accuse a man who's been dead, for roughly as long as I've been alive, of malicious sexism, since that wouldn't really be fair. I'm just saying given Awdry was a man of God first, and a children's book author second, it's safe to assume he could have internalized the sexism present within the church's dogma without even realizing it, especially considering women had only been allowed to vote in the US for 20 years by the time he was ordained as a priest. It really wouldn't be much of a stretch to suggest this internalized sexism unconsciously spilled over into the Railway series. I'm not just making this up despite those in the fandom who put Reverend Awdry on a pedestal. The proof is in the pudding, or steam in this case. The first step is to see just how many female characters are in the Railway series. The answer is 31, but that's out of about 94 characters. Plus, 5 of those female characters weren't even created by Wilbert, but rather his son. Regardless, this means roughly 33% of the characters in the Railway series are female, which doesn't sound that bad, until you realize 22 of them are coaches or rolling stock of some kind. It gets worse when you realize that out of the 9 remaining characters who can actually move under their own power, 7 are about as minor as characters can get without being unnamed, only had 1 appearance or both. This leaves a mere 2 female characters that have any sort of significance. Those who aren't as familiar with the series as diehard tankies like myself are, might be wondering what's wrong with so many female characters being rolling stock. Well, from a narrative standpoint, it limits the appearances that a character can have in both amount and nature, especially since most named rolling stock are strongly linked with an engine. Annie and Clarabelle are Thomas's coaches, Toad is Oliver's brake van, Henrietta is Toby's coach. You get the picture. This leads me to the bigger problem related to sexism, and it's the lack of agency that all these female characters have when they can't even move without an engine, who's almost always going to be male. Getting back to the 2 female characters that aren't just footnotes, they also have their own set of problems. There's how they're characterized, more specifically the fact that the personalities of both Mavis and Daisy could be described as rather divisive. It's not that there's anything inherently wrong with female characters having divisive personalities, but it does become an issue when it causes half the audience to be at risk of hating the only female characters in a piece of media. This is somewhat mitigated by Mavis mellowing out greatly after her debut, but my point still stands regarding Daisy, proven by how much I personally despise her. Added to that is both of them being Diesels. I know the Steam versus Diesel racism controversy is a subject some tankies don't like to talk about, but whether they like it or not, anti-Diesel prejudice prejudice in the Thomas the Tank Engine universe exists. It may not be an exact one-to-one match to racism in the real world, but prejudice is prejudice. This was especially true in the early days of the series because at that time, all diesels were suspected of being bad until proven otherwise. So even if you were to take the whole sexism thing out of the equation, Daisy and Mavis would still be at a disadvantage. Your next question probably is, how should one respond to all this? Should you go on an online moral crusade against Audrey and or accuse anyone who likes the Railway series of being a closeted sexist? Obviously not. Cancel culture does more harm than good, and the latter option is just stupid. You can still like what you like, but with the knowledge that the Railway series was a product of its time. Situations like this is why concepts like death of the author are so important. Who an author was or is as a person should have very little bearing on the perception of their writing. After all, people used the same logic to continue liking Harry Potter after its author got cancelled. Which brings up my hot take on that. J.K. Rowling did nothing wrong. It's not like Reverend Audrey is even alive to defend himself. And Thomas the Tank Engine has recently made some pretty good strides at closing the gender gap in the franchise. Not without a vocal minority of Tankies complaining about new female characters, getting more of a spotlight than the same old 7 male engines. But the fact there was any backlash is exactly why this video needs to exist. People have to realize how kids can internalize what they see in the shows they watch. Maybe trains and railroading wouldn't be perceived as something for boys if more little girls saw themselves well represented in Thomas the Tank Engine. I can only hope this video connects with someone out there, since I don't see anyone in the fandom addressing the issue, and if it did, please consider leaving this video a like, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'd love to hear about the experiences of female rail fans or tankies in the comments down below.